Hi, my name is Pat Woods. I'm the Director of Religious Education at Abraham Lincoln Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Springfield, Illinois. And I'm here today to offer you the Time for All Ages. Now, today's Time for All Ages is a little bittersweet for me because one of my heroes, John Lewis, passed away yesterday at 80 years old. Now, I hope you do anyhow, recognize the name. He was a representative from Georgia for several decades, and he was also an icon in the civil rights movement. And I've just finished a book about the Freedom Riders, and John Lewis was one of the Freedom Riders. So that's what I'd like to share with you today. Now, the Freedom Riders, for those of you who don't know a great deal about them, were a group of a little more than 400 volunteers who traveled throughout the South. They were on regularly scheduled bus lines for about 7 months in 1961. And the reason they were on the buses is because in 1960, the Supreme Court had ruled that segregated facilities for interstate passengers were illegal. So that meant you couldn't have whites only and blacks only facilities, whether they were restrooms or waiting rooms or water fountains or whatever. And as we know from history, the Supreme Court may have made the ruling, but that did not mean that all the states were complying with it. And so these folks got together. And they were young folks, many of them. About 75% of them were between 18 and 30. About half of them were black, about a quarter of them were women, and many of them were college students. Some actually had a religious background. There were some Episcopal clergy and some Yale divinity students. And then there were also some from the civil rights group. Now, one of the main civil rights group was the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and it was that group that initiated the Freedom Rides. Now, it had been founded on Gandhi's principle of nonviolent protest, and their goal, as I had mentioned earlier, was to, and I'm quoting here, create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce the law. So in other words, if the states weren't going to do what the Supreme Court said they were going to do, then this group was going to highlight that so that the states would have to do what the Supreme Court said. Now, the volunteers came from about 40 states, and they actually received training in nonviolent tactics. Now, training in nonviolent tactic means that if you are pushed or hit or spit on or called names or have things thrown at you, you will not strike back. And in the training, they would weed out the folks who did not have that capacity. Well, John Lewis did have that capacity, and at 21, he was already a veteran of the sit-ins that had happened at the lunch counters in Nashville, and he was actually the first Freedom Rider to be assaulted. He tried to enter a whites-only waiting room in South Carolina, and two men jumped him. They hit him and they kicked him in the ribs, and even so, less than 2 weeks later, he still joined a bus ride that was bound for Jackson. In his words, we were determined not to let any act of violence keep us from our goal. And he added, we knew our lives could be threatened, but we had made up our minds not to turn back. And because of his example, folks like Barack Obama will look at John Lewis, as Obama did during his inauguration, as a person upon whose shoulders he stood to become the person that he was. And just yesterday, Obama also said about Lewis that Lewis loved this country so much that he risked his life and his blood so that it might live up to his promise. And through the decades, he not only gave all of himself to the cause of freedom and justice, but inspired generations that followed to try to live up to his example. Well, I know for me personally, John Lewis has always been a hero and someone to whom I looked as a role model. And I bring him to you today so that you know about our history and you know about some of the things that happened to get us to where we are today. And if you look at where we are today, we still have a ways to go. And I would hope that we could take a look at John Lewis and his example and perhaps let him inspire us as we continue the quest for racial and social justice here in the United States. Thank you, John Lewis. Thank you. And I'll see you all next week.